Past and Present is the title of this year's edition of Global Axess. Is it possible to draw conclusions from past events? Or is man doomed to repeat the mistakes of yesterday? How do authoritarian regimes use their own country's history to secure power? And what role does the individual play? In these interviews, researchers, journalists and writers try to answer these questions. Vernon Bogdanor, Professor of Political Science at King's College, believes that when looking at history, we shouldn't underestimate the part that the individual plays. Winston Churchill, Charles De Gaulle and Jean Monnet. Would history have been the same without them? Is it the structure or individuals that matter most? Niklas Ekdahl interviews Vernon Bogdanor.
Now, is there such a thing as great men and women in history, and how would you define greatness in that case?
Well, scientists tell me there's no such thing as an individually great scientist, that a discovery made by a scientist would only be delayed by a few years if that particular scientist hadn't existed. And also, scientists tend to work collectively. Now, is that true in history? Some people think it is. For example, a Marxist would say the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 would have occurred even if Lenin hadn't existed. It was due to objective factors. It might have been a bit later, perhaps, but it would have happened. And very famously, in the epilogue to War and Peace, Tolstoy says exactly the same. He satirizes historians who say the French Revolution broke out because of faults of Louis XVI, or that Napoleon altered history. He said, we only think that because we simply don't have enough understanding of the real processes of history which these people represent. And he said Napoleon knew less about what was happening at the Battle of Borodino than his humblest soldier. Now, is history really like that? I don't think so. Let's take a few examples. For example, Britain in 1940 had objectively lost the war. We'd retreated from Europe after Dunkirk. We were told we'd got the men out. We weren't told that the tanks and the equipment were left behind. We only had a few hundred rifles in the southeast of England to repel an invasion. And yet when people heard Churchill, they were convinced that Britain was going to win the war. It's an extraordinary achievement. And it was summed up very laconically by Churchill's deputy prime minister in the war, Clement Attlee, who became Labour prime minister after the war. He was asked what Churchill had done to win the war, and Attlee said he talked about it. And you can take another example from French history, from De Gaulle in 1958. I think few would then have predicted that France would have a stable democracy because it had been highly unstable since the 1870s, and it was threatened with a military coup from paratroops in Algeria. Nevertheless, de Gaulle put France on a stable trajectory, indeed made her the leading power in Europe. Now, when we think about Europe, who in 1945 would have predicted reconciliation between France and Germany? But that was achieved in large part through the European community, now the European Union.
Jean Monnet.
Which was Jean Monnet. And he's a fascinating figure because he was never elected to anything in his life. His influence was behind the scenes. And this shows that to be a hero in history, you don't necessarily need to have power or patronage. Martin Luther King was a hero in history, Gandhi, and so on. So I do most profoundly believe in the importance of individuals in history. And I think the social sciences find it very, very difficult to explain it.
Mm. And how should one view the causality here? I mean, if you look at the examples of Churchill and de Gaulle that you mentioned, were they great leaders who rose to the occasion, or could they also be viewed as stubborn narcissists who happened to be in the right place at the right time? Something like that.
Well, I suppose if you look at the psychology of these people, they are very different from the norm. Stubborn narcissist is probably right. But as you imply, great leaders are leaders in context, in particular times. Churchill had made some very unwise decisions in the 1930s. He'd opposed self-government for India.
And during the First World War,
Gallipoli, yes. Gallipoli. He was tarred with that brush as well, that seemed a misjudgment. And de Gaulle, in the late 40s and 50s, seemed to make ill-judged decisions as well. All depends on the context and the, as it were, coincidence of a great leader and a certain period of time. And it's fair to say democracies don't need great leaders all the time, only in times of crisis. There is a very interesting passage in a play by the German playwright Bertolt Brecht, when one of the characters says, "Unhappy is the country that has no heroes," but the reply is no, unhappy is the country that needs heroes. I mean, take a country like Switzerland, which is on the whole well governed. Could you name the president of the Swiss Confederation? I'm surely not. Switzerland doesn't need heroes. Sweden probably doesn't need heroes either. Norway did in the war, certainly. But Sweden probably doesn't need heroes. It's a very lucky country like Switzerland.
Yeah, true. You have referred to a conversation you had with the philosopher Isaiah Berlin.
Yes.
With the example from music.
Yes.
Where he used Debussy as an example
Yes.
of a true genius, as opposed to Brahms, for instance.
Yes.
What's the difference there
Well,
in music?
genius, whether in politics or the arts, is discontinuity. It's something that could not have been predicted from what happened in the past. My example of France, let me return to that for a moment. In 1958, you couldn't, I think, have predicted the Fifth Republic or French leadership in Europe. In 1945, you couldn't have predicted European unity. Now, if you take the example from music, I think you probably could have predicted Brahms from Beethoven, but I think you couldn't have predicted Debussy from anyone else. Nor, if you look at this part of the world, could you probably have predicted Sibelius from anyone else. So they are geniuses, where Brahms, though a great composer, is not quite a genius because there's no element of discontinuity. Wagner was a genius, but Richard Strauss, who followed Wagner, was not a genius, I think, but a great composer.
Right. And applying that principle to politics,
Yes.
I mean, if you look at nation building or international relations, it seems easier to destroy things than to build things, in a way. I mean, it's easier to turn an aquarium into a fish soup than the other way around, if you will. So what's the role of personalities there compared to, say, technology or constitutions?
Well, I think fundamental, again, I come back to the example of Jean Monnet, who built Europe in his image. Arguably now, I think, too much in his image, because I think the process of integration has probably now gone far enough. And I think the Monnet method is no longer satisfactory. I think you need more of a method of cooperation between governments rather than integration. But he was right for his time. And I think that is an important way of building institutions. I suppose the people who built NATO after the war, the people who built the rule-governed system of international relations, which has kept the peace in Europe since 1945. But as we know, that rule-governed system is now under threat, particularly perhaps from Donald Trump in America. Some would say also from Brexit. It's under threat, which I think is a pity.
How do you interpret that? I mean, it's been one generation, if you will, since this horrible experience of the last World War. Is that the main factor why this system is under pressure?
Yes, I think it is. I think people have got used to peace. They've taken it for granted. Let's look for comparison at the period before 1914. Europe had had 100 years of peace. People were thinking it could easily be preserved. They think it could be preserved even by a small war against Serbia. It wasn't really in danger. What would happen? Now people think, well, perhaps a shake-up of the international order would be a good thing. We can easily contain it. I think history shows you can't easily contain it. People tend to take peace for granted. It shouldn't be taken for granted. It's won with great difficulty, and it needs great care to preserve it. And I do think your generational point is very important in that context.
And if you look at the personalities of 1914, for instance, I mean, Europe stumbled into war unintentionally, basically, because we had forgotten what it meant.
Well, I don't, if I may say so, I don't agree with that. I think Germany and Austria started the war and hoped and believed that it could be contained. And that was the error they made. It was the error of the Austrian government and
the German military.
The German military, but also I think the German civilian leadership have evaded responsibility. I think whatever they said after the war, they could have stopped the military. The Kaiser, oddly enough, I think was too much blamed. I think people didn't take him seriously, and he blew hot and cold. But I think the Chancellor, Bethmann Hollweg, evaded responsibility by blaming the military. I think the thesis in Christopher Clark's book was Sleepwalkers, which has had a lot of publicity in Europe, I think is completely wrong. I think people didn't slither into war accidentally. I think people rarely go to war accidentally. I think that doesn't often happen.
And you have said that political genius is, by definition, amoral.
Yes.
Could you explain that?
Yes, well, if you give someone power, they can use it for good purposes or evil purposes. Now, if you look at extreme examples of evil purposes, Stalin, Hitler, Pol Pot, Mao, and so on, the question for democracies is how you can contain power so that you can ensure that leadership is used for good purposes and not for evil purposes. That's a huge dilemma which all democracies face.
And what's the common denominator between these evil geniuses that you mentioned? I mean, Mao, Pol Pot, Saddam Hussein, Gaddafi, and so forth.
Well, of course, they all came from authoritarian or totalitarian societies. That is the great danger. Once you abandon the rule of law and liberal institutions, you're in great danger. That can't be contained either. I mean, the Russians perhaps thought it could be contained for a brief while by Lenin, but then you had Stalin.
Yeah, and in that sort of political environment, the dynamics seem to be pretty universal. I mean, the rise of Saddam Hussein had similarities to Stalin, for instance. The most ruthless guy ends up running the place.
Yeah, absolutely. Saddam Hussein rather admired Stalin. He was his role model, I think. And the 20th century has seen the growth not just of, as it were, old-fashioned dictatorships, but totalitarian systems that have killed very large numbers of people. And Churchill once said the 20th century was the century of the common man because in no other century have so many common men been killed. And that it was a new phenomenon, mass murder, which wasn't there, I think, in previous centuries. And I think the depredations of people like Napoleon or even Genghis Khan pale into insignificance by the side of Hitler, Stalin, Saddam Hussein, Mao Zedong, and so on.
Yes. So the conclusion, I mean, the best insurance against this is democracy and the rule of law.
An open society, as Karl Popper said, not only democracy, but a liberal society that preserves the rights of minorities and freedoms and the rule of law and so on. Someone once said, when law ends, hell begins, and I think that's right. Karl Popper summed it up well, I think.
Yeah, and when you look around today, you find the open society under threat?
No question. I think particularly and sadly in the United States under Donald Trump, I think there's no question of that. But tendencies in other societies, the ex-communist countries of Eastern Europe, even in some of the Western societies, the growth of what we call populism, which even Sweden is not inoculated against. All these things are dangerous, I think, because the populists dispute the right of minorities and they take the view that a majority in a democracy can do whatever it likes, which was also, of course, Hitler's doctrine carried to extremes, that because he had majority support, he could tyrannize over minorities. And that is the great danger of populism. I think Mr. Orban thinks that. Certainly the Iranians think that, the theocracy in Iran. They won an election and think they can tyrannize in any way they like.
One of your former students was David Cameron, right? Who moved on to become a Conservative Party leader and Prime Minister of Britain. And is going to go down in history because he called the Brexit referendum that has caused a bit of a crisis in Europe and chaos in British politics. Having such a transformational impact, is that genius of sorts as well?
I'm not sure that he was transformational. He called the referendum because there were great pressures on him, both from his own backbenchers and from the new United Kingdom Independence Party. And what he said in his speech in which he called for the referendum was that consent for Europe in Britain was wafer thin and needed to be legitimised. And he said if it wasn't legitimised, it would fester and eventually Britain would leave. Well, in a sense, what happened in the referendum bears out what he said, because the majority of British people decided they didn't want to stay in the European Union. And if in a democracy that is the view of people, it has to be respected. I was on the other side, I should say. I favoured Remain. But if that is the view of people, then you have to go along with that. So what he did was to give people, as it were, the chance to express their view, which surely there can't be anything wrong with that. And I think that a lot of the criticism of it was very unfair, really.
So given the circumstances, it wasn't such a bad call, you think, to call them?
No, and I think any leader would have had to do it because the pressures were very, very great. It was a safety valve, if you like. Without that, pressure and hostility to the elite would have built up.
But I suppose he, as well as you and many others, me included, were quite surprised by the outcome.
Yes.
Right? Was that predictable somehow, or? when you let the genie out of that bottle?
Well, the British have never liked Europe much. They don't really feel they belong. To some extent, the Swedes are not that different, I think. They're, as it were, on the periphery of Europe. And I think Britain has more in common with Sweden than it does with, say, France or Germany. But Europe was never really a salient or important issue for British voters until the issue of immigration came to be mixed up with it. And that, in turn, came to be mixed up with something else, which is migration from Syria. And people were fearful that Turkey might join the European Union, bringing with it lots of Turks and Syrian migrants, which obviously was not going to happen. Though it's fair to say the EU is subject to criticism because it could not control either its external or its internal borders, and that has caused very serious problems. But it was immigration, I think, that was the key factor in causing Brexit, together with the feeling of so-called taking back control that the British felt they wanted Westminster to make their laws and not Brussels.
And Sweden is definitely going to miss the UK in the European Union, but paradoxically, it has made the European Union more popular than ever in Sweden, seeing the debacle in Britain surrounding Brexit. So that's a rather unexpected outcome in a way, that it has brought Europe
that is true.
Together, right?
And
Consolidation.
Sweden has the position in Europe that Britain had, and in my view should have retained, because Sweden has the benefits of being in the internal market, the benefits of free trade and free markets, but doesn't accept what it doesn't like, in particular the euro. Although I think Sweden is legally obliged to join the euro, it's not going to do so. And similarly with other countries, for example, Poland. One Polish official said to me, Poland is 5 years away from joining the euro and always will be. And so that won't happen. Now, Britain had lots of opt-outs, not only from the euro, but from the Schengen agreement as well. And they had a good position of balance, in my opinion. They're now, having been in Europe with lots of opt-outs, they're moving out of Europe but want lots of opt-ins, which is a much more difficult thing to negotiate. So I think perhaps it is a warning for Sweden, as you imply. And Sweden and also Denmark have, in my view, an ideal position in the European Union. They accept what they want to accept and ignore the rest.
Right. And speaking of David Cameron,
yes.
I mean, when he was your student, were there any signs in hindsight that he would go on to have this stellar political career, and which would finally create an existential crisis for the Tory party as well?
Not really. I mean, he was a very clever man, a very nice man, perhaps unusual for a politician to be both. He got an outstanding degree, a first-class degree, and an extremely popular person. But no, I wouldn't have thought that it was obvious that he was going to be in politics. Unlike Boris Johnson, he didn't play a prominent part in Oxford politics. In fact, he played no part in that. He just got on with his work. Whereas Boris became president of the Oxford Union, which is a traditional sort of nursery for politicians. So you could predict that he would be interested in politics, but not so much David Cameron, I think.
Your most recent book is called Beyond Brexit, Brexit Towards a British Constitution. So what's your best guess now? Do you think the UK will leave the European Union on October 31st, 2019?
It's very dangerous to predict anything about Brexit, and what you say today might be shown to be untrue tomorrow. But nevertheless, let me stick my neck out and say I think we will leave on October the 31st. I think it's probably right to say that if we don't, there will be a tsunami of rage in Britain, and that was shown in the recent European Parliament elections when, as you know, the Brexit party came first. And that was because people said the politicians asked us to make a decision, they promised they would abide by it, but 3 years after the referendum, we are still in the European Union. So I think it's likely we will leave on October the 31st.
And Britain's entry into the European community in 1973, that was a momentous moment in history. Will an exit be equally momentous if you look at it from your constitutional?
Yes, absolutely, because we're doing something very unusual in the modern world. We are moving out of a constitutional system, which is the European Union, to our own British system, which, as you know, has no constitution. And perhaps even more important, we're exiting an important international human rights regime because the European Union has a Charter of Fundamental Rights, and our rights in future will be protected entirely by Parliament. Now, we have to ask the question in Britain, that given that the other 27 member states of the EU are still governed by a Charter of Fundamental Rights which limits what they can do, are our parliamentarians so much more sensitive to human rights that they can be entrusted with that important function? I myself think not, and that we should have our own Bill of Rights to compensate for the fact we're leaving the European Union.
And you have suggested that this should be Britain's constitutional moment.
Yes, I say that more in hope than expectation.
Yeah. Or else? I mean, what's at stake without the European Union and the
we don't know what the rules are. I mean, someone once said that life without rules is nasty, British and short. And, for example, on the referendum itself, we don't know when should they be held. Should there be a threshold of votes required? Should they be legally binding or not? All these things are up in the air. Then there's talk about proroguing, that is dissolving Parliament for a period to avoid Parliament being able to express a view on Brexit. Now, is that constitutional? We don't know. Then there are problems arising with devolution because the EU was the glue that held the devolution settlement together. And that also is important. We need an agreed set of rules. We're one of just 3 democracies without a constitution, the other 2 being New Zealand and Israel. Now, New Zealand's very small and Israel's developing a constitution, but very, very slowly. And we are very anomalous in that respect, I think. And I think it's time we aligned ourselves with almost every other democracy in the world.
So the EU has kept the UK together and also maintained peace in Northern Ireland. So is there a way to square this circle and leave the European Union while maintaining the unity of the United Kingdom?
Well, it's fair to say that support for Scottish independence has declined slightly in the last year or two, and that it would be much more difficult for Scotland to be independent with the rest of the country outside the European Union than if we were all inside the European Union, because there would be then a border between Scotland and England, which couldn't be there if England was still in the European Union. Northern Ireland is a more serious problem, I think, because the whole peace process is predicated on a soft border between Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom, and the Irish Republic, which of course is an independent country. And that's a very difficult problem to solve and hasn't yet been solved.
And what did you make of the campaign leading up to the referendum? I mean, how well informed was the majority that voted for Brexit in terms of the economy, constitutional issues and so on?
Well, those who've lost the referendum, and I was one of them, but a lot of those who lost the referendum say it wasn't fairly conducted because they said there was deceit on the part of the other side, on the Leave side. And they quote a lot about the £350 million a week that goes to the EU. Now that is a gross figure, it's not a net figure. It's not wholly unfair to use it because if I ask you how much tax you pay, you give me the gross percentage, you don't include the benefits you get back from the state. A grosser form of deceit was the deceit that Turkey was shortly to enter the European Union, that Britain couldn't veto it, and that 80 million Turks would therefore have the right to come to Britain. That was false. But it's also true to say that there were things said on the other side which weren't wholly correct. For example, the Chancellor and the Governor of the Bank of England said there'd be an immediate recession and need for an emergency budget. Well, actually, employment is higher than it's ever been. Now, the truth is that elections and referendums are not academic seminars and that people are not on oath in those things. And it's up to the electorate to judge. To give a famous example from British history, in 1945, Winston Churchill said that the socialist government in Britain would require Gestapo if it was to carry out its policies. Now, that is clearly absurd.
Right.
And it's up to the public to judge. And in my opinion, although I was on the losing side, I think most voters listened to the arguments on both sides and they made their judgment, they weighed them up, they took it very seriously. And I think one of the arguments for referendums is it does bring people actually into the decision-making process. And our great liberal philosopher, John Stuart Mill, once said that we don't learn to cycle or to swim by reading books about it, but by doing it. And so you don't learn about democracy by reading books about it, but by participating in making decisions, which is what happened with the referendum. So I take the perhaps minority view, it was a fine exercise in democratic participation and showed the British do not want to remain in the European Union.
Right. And the Tory politician Michael Gove he famously said during the campaign that this country has had enough of experts. Could experts such as yourself have proven him wrong and made a stronger case for remaining, you think?
I think what Michael Gove said, which is taken out of context, was experts such as those who come from international organizations who got things wrong, and he meant the IMF. Now, how many of the economic experts predicted the economic downturn of 2008? And as I said a few minutes ago, they predicted an immediate recession if we left the European Union and an emergency budget.
That may still happen if we have a hard Brexit in October.
Well, it might, but employment at the moment is higher than it's ever been in Britain, and we are doing actually quite well. And the truth is, the social sciences have taken a kicking from the economic credit crunch, which hardly anyone predicted. And the truth is, they're not hard sciences. I mean, if you're a physicist, there are certain laws, say, of thermodynamics, and if you don't accept them, you're not taken seriously. Now, there's no real equivalent in political science. It's not that sort of subject. It's a historical subject. And I think people were claiming more expertise than they had, partly as a result of your people, the media, who try and get us to make dogmatic statements, and no doubt I'm as guilty of that as anyone else, but we shouldn't be. We should be much more careful and qualified in our judgments about what is happening.
So Michael Gove had a point, you think?
Yes, he did have a point, I think, yes.
And you already mentioned migration as a crucial factor. And this, the financial crisis of 2008, I mean, where the experts really were proven wrong, and the Iraq invasion perhaps in 2003. Did those events also play a role, do you think, in the Brexit?
Well, absolutely.
Mistrust in elites. And
people confused migration from Syria with free movement within the European Union. But as you say, the credit crunch was crucial because that led people to think that the elite's judgments on economics weren't as wise as they'd been led to believe. They were told the bankers were all wise. They were shown to be unethical and unsound in their judgments. And that was followed in Britain by a parliamentary expenses crisis when many MPs were shown to have misused their expenses claims. So there was another reason for distrusting the elite and thinking the elite disdain ordinary people. There's one rule for them, and the bankers got off scot-free, but another rule for ordinary people. And that led to the rise of what is sometimes called populism.
And the spectacular success of the Brexit party in the European elections, is that part of the fallout, you'd say?
Absolutely. Well, that, as I said a few moments ago, is because the elite said they would take account of what people said, they would implement the decision, and they haven't done so because they don't like it. And Brexit has polarised the sovereignty of the people, which is in favour of Brexit, against the sovereignty of Parliament, which is strongly pro-Remain. It's a constitutional crisis, if you like, and people say that the elite have been evading the decision.
But you have a rather optimistic take then on all these things going on. I mean, it's a process of education and dialectics, if you will.
Yes, I think people are often too pessimistic, particularly about Britain. When we lost the American colonies in the late 18th century, I beg your pardon, in the late 18th century, one young man said to Adam Smith, "This will ruin the country." And Adam Smith said, "Young man, there's a lot of ruin in a nation." And I think Britain is a stable country, which will remain very stable. And Parliament often doesn't reflect that. It's raucous debate often, and a very tough debate. But the country, in my view, will remain a highly stable and progressive democracy. So I am more optimistic than many.
Thank you. That will have to be the last word because our hourglass has run out. Thank you, Vernon Bogdanor.
Thank you.